Look upon the majesty of the Emperor's realm and witness an eternity of grinding gears and shattered spines. Across 1,000,000 worlds, the teeming masses of humanity exist for a single, inexorable purpose. They are the flesh that feeds the great engines of survival. Trillions of souls are born into the choking smog of hive cities, laboring in the belly of macro-manufactorums until their lungs blacken and their bones snap under the weight of impossible quotas. There is no dawn for the hab worker, only the endless flicker of lumen strips cutting through the oily haze. Generations live and die without ever seeing a natural sky, their entire existence spent stamping out mass-reactive shells or refining promethium to feed a war machine that spans the stars. This is the ultimate truth of the human condition in the 41st millennium. We are an empire built upon an endless foundation of ash, fueled by the unceasing sacrifice of the uncountable anonymous. Yet even within this suffocating hell, the human mind remains a fragile instrument. It cannot endure a lifetime of unbroken misery without fracturing into madness or, far worse, heresy and rebellion. The Adeptus Terra and the planetary governors understand this philosophical necessity with cold, calculating precision. A beast of burden must be allowed a momentary breath, lest its heart burst before the harvest is complete. Thus, we arrive at the great paradox of our imperiled existence. Even in the darkest era of mankind, humanity desperately seeks distraction. We are provided with the ancient, cynical remedy of bread and circuses, though the bread is merely processed corpse starch and the circuses run red with the blood of the desperate. Do not be deceived into believing that leisure in the Imperium is a true respite from the overarching violence of the galaxy. There is no joy to be found here, no gentle reprieve from the grinding darkness. Instead, what is offered to the citizenry is a pure, concentrated distillation of the very brutality that defines our age. Leisure is merely another mechanism of control, a carefully sanctioned cruelty that serves to reinforce the grand hierarchy of suffering. To survive the cosmic horrors that press against the borders of our reality, the masses require a mirror of their own daily agony, neatly packaged and presented as entertainment. When the factory sirens howl the end of a punishing shift, the exhausted worker does not seek quiet reflection. They seek a spectacle of absolute domination. They crave a visceral display of survival that validates their own wretched endurance. This psychic pressure valve is meticulously maintained by the state, for they know that sanctioned slaughter distracts from the hunger gnawing at the belly. The hatred that might otherwise be directed upward at the gilded spires of the nobility is instead focused downward, channeled into the roaring pits of public spectacle. We do not retreat from the horrors of the universe when we seek diversion. We build towering monuments to it, consecrating our precious few hours of freedom with the screams of the dying. The transition from the assembly line to the viewing stands is merely a shift from the creation of war to the eager consumption of it. The collective hunger for violence must inevitably be fed, drawing the ravenous gaze of billions toward the blood-stained sands of the fighting pits. To understand this pressure valve, one must look downward into the abyssal depths of Necromunda. Here, within the suffocating and toxic darkness of the Underhive, the sport of Grav-Ball is not merely a game, but a brutal engine of survival and desperate commerce. The arenas are rusted, blood-stained pits carved into the crumbling architecture of ancient, abandoned dome stadiums. Shadows cling to jagged bulkheads and shattered luminaries where countless generations of forgotten souls have bled out upon the pitted ferrocrete. This is the true, unforgiving canon of the courts, a tradition born in the venomous fumes of the lowest sumps. Hive scum and hardened gang members flock to these shattered amphitheatres, hungry for a fleeting taste of glory in a life otherwise destined for the corpse starch grinders. They share these treacherous pitches with the rugged iron-head squat prospectors, whose dense frames, industrial plating and stubborn endurance make them terrifying adversaries in the close-quarters scrum. The aesthetic of the sport in these lightless depths is defined by pure, unrestrained brutality. Players encase themselves in scavenged, heavy armor layered with jagged iron spikes, their veins burning with highly addictive chemstims that push their starving bodies far beyond their natural mortal limits. They hurl themselves recklessly across the rusted, uneven pitch, treating every defensive tackle as an opportunity to shatter bone and tear flesh. Suspended above the perilous court, the screaming crowds of underhivers demand a continuous spectacle of carnage, their roaring, feral voices entirely drowning out the agonizing cries of the maimed players below. When a goal is finally scored, it is never met with polite applause or noble cheers, but rather with riotous, unchecked violence. Spectators and athletes alike erupt into frenzied brawls on the sidelines, causing the delicate boundary between a competitive match and a full-scale turf war to dissolve into a single chaotic tide of bloodshed. This perpetual, localized slaughter serves a very deliberate and deeply cynical purpose within the rigid hierarchy of the hive. Local enforcers and the planetary elite actively sanction the blood sport, using the brutal Grav-Ball leagues to distract the volatile gang houses from waging larger, more destructive wars over lucrative hab-block territories. It is considered far more efficient to let the underclass murder one another over the trajectory of a heavy metallic sphere than to expend valuable munitions policing a sector-wide uprising. This miserable spectacle represents the absolute baseline of the sport throughout the countless worlds of the wider Imperium. It is a profoundly raw, unrefined, and desperately human endeavor, perfectly mirroring the inherent cruelty of daily existence among the teeming, oppressed billions. In the sprawling underhive, Grav-Ball remains a chaotic clash of hopeless survivors fighting desperately for a single scrap of renown before their inevitable, violent demise in the dark. Yet this crude, blood-soaked pastime of the lowly masses does not remain confined to the forgotten and decaying underbellies of imperial hive worlds. The fundamental, bone-breaking violence of the game possesses a certain tactical purity, a ruthless momentum that has drawn the unwavering gaze of beings existing far above the miserable station of mere gang scum. Where the starved dregs of humanity utilize the sport to bleed away their petty frustrations and territorial grievances, the absolute pinnacle of imperial martial might has recognized the arena as an ideal crucible to sharpen the ultimate instruments of war. Far beyond the neon squalor of the hive cities, the concept of sport sheds its theatrical veneer and embraces its true purpose as a crucible of war. To the Adeptus Astartes, there is no such thing as a mere game. Upon the irradiated ash wastes of Baal and the feral death worlds of the galactic fringe, brutal tribal contests serve as the ultimate proving grounds for those who would seek to join the ranks of the Emperor's Angels of Death. Here, the civilian distractions of Grav-Ball and Hivegrid are stripped of their manufactured glamour. They are reborn as primal blood sports played by unaugmented youths who vie for the ultimate prize of ascension. High above these wretched arenas, deep within the silent halls of orbital spires, the chapter masters watch. They do not observe these contests to be entertained. Their augmented eyes track every collision and every display of raw, unbridled violence with cold, calculated precision. They are searching for the rarest of traits within these fragile mortal frames. They look for hyper-aggression that borders on madness, yet remains tethered by an innate tactical instinct. They measure pain tolerance in the face of agonizing, crippling injury. In these sacred trials, sportsmanship is an Xenos concept, a weakness that would be swiftly punished on the battlefield. To a space marine, these matches are nothing more than brutal, attritional wars designed to separate the chosen few from the forgotten dead. The sheer brutality of these trials cannot be overstated. Consider the harrowing spectacle of a young aspirant, his frail human body pushed to the absolute limits of endurance. He clutches a heavy, iron-shod sphere to his chest as he charges through a throng of desperate rivals. A monstrous tackle from a much larger competitor shatters his ribs with a sickening crack that echoes across the canyon. Most mortals would succumb to the shock of such an impact, surrendering to the void of unconsciousness. Yet this boy does not yield. Gasping through lungs pierced by his own broken bones, He crawls forward through the dirt. He drags his ruined frame and the rusted ball across a scoring line drawn in chalk, dust, and the blood of those who failed before him. This single act of indomitable defiance proves the utility of the sport as an instrument of divine selection. The chaplains and masters of recruits nod in the shadows, marking the broken boy for the apotheosis of gene seed implantation. Yet this chaotic display of savagery is not devoid of structure. It is governed by ancient statutes and absolute laws that dictate every movement, every collision, and every scoring strike. To truly comprehend how mortal flesh is tested before it is elevated to godhood, one must delve into the very mechanics of the slaughter. The parameters of the arena, the complex gravitational forces acting upon the players, and the exact constraints of the competition form a rigid framework of violence. Before the starting horn sounds, the precise rules and the unforgiving physics of this holy trial must be understood. To understand the butchers who take to the field is only half the equation, for the theatre of their war is just as lethal. The instrument of their violent communion is known as the null sphere. It is a core of ultra-dense matter, forged from depleted uranium and ship hull adamantium, housed within a scarred shell of grox leather and riveted iron. Woven deeply into its heavy casing are temperamental, localized anti-grav suspensors. This arcane machinery makes the sphere profoundly unpredictable in flight. It can drift like a ghost upon a thermal vent, hovering just out of a leaping player's reach, only to suddenly assert its terrifying true mass the moment it is violently struck. A descending null sphere carries enough kinetic energy to cave in a flakboard barricade, and it will effortlessly crush the skull of any athlete who misjudges its plummeting velocity. The pitch itself is a sprawling nightmare of architectural malice, specifically engineered to test the absolute limits of mortal endurance. Players must navigate vast zero-gravity zones that leave the unwary suspended as helpless, drifting targets for the opposition. The absolute boundaries of the arena are cordoned by crackling high-voltage electrostatic fields, hungry to incinerate anyone unfortunate enough to be thrown against them. Beneath their spiked boots, the playing surface is secretly lined with deeply buried, erratic grav plates. Without a single klaxon of warning, these localized gravity wells will randomly invert, violently launching groaning scrums of men high into the blood-misted air, or slamming them downward with enough force to shatter their spines. Survival within this crucible demands an instinctive, feral mastery of a constantly shifting environment. The codified rules of engagement dictate the flow of blood, and they are enforced with absolute zealotry. Ranged weapons of any classification are strictly forbidden. The carnage must always remain intimately and brutally physical. Forward passes of the null sphere are legally permitted, but hurling a fluctuating gravity mass at high speeds makes the act of catching it an inherently lethal endeavor. To receive a perfectly thrown pass is to invite total skeletal obliteration. Traditional tackling has been entirely replaced by sanctioned kinetic strikes, turning every defensive block and offensive interception into an exercise in maximized blunt force trauma. The overseers of this localized slaughter are the arbitrators. They are merciless judges drawn from the ranks of hardened enforcers, pacing the electrified sidelines in thick carapace armor and wielding the Emperor's absolute authority. In this grim arena, there are no gentle reprimands or momentary pauses. A minor infraction is punished by the targeted mechanical breaking of an offender's limb. A severe violation of the sacred edicts is rewarded with an immediate summary execution by a heavy bolt pistol to the back of the helmet. The match does not pause for the clearing of the resulting corpses. This is a perpetual engine of momentum and murder, a relentless meat grinder where ultimate glory is strictly measured in spilled viscera. Yet beneath the roaring crowd and the thunder of shattered ribs, a deeper resonance echoes through the darkened stadium. The foundational shape of this atrocity, the frantic drive to carry a sphere across a violently contested line, stirs a deeply buried ancestral memory. It whispers of a forgotten epoch long before the galaxy burned with endless war, pointing toward a mythological predecessor born upon the ancient, lost soil of Terra. Yet the structured violence of Grav-Ball is merely a shadow cast by a far older and darker light. Deep within the dust-choked stasis vaults of Terra, blind archivists and void-born scholars endlessly pore over fragmented data slates dating back to the forgotten epochs of the second millennium. These shattered cogitator cores whisper of an ancestral ritual played upon sacred geometry known to the ancients as the gridiron. In these broken historical records, mortals clad in rudimentary unpowered armor hurled themselves at one another with murderous intent, all for the possession of a singular sacred sphere. Time and the ruinous tides of the Imperium have twisted these Terran memories into something far stranger than mere sport. Warp echoes bleed through the veil of reality, birthing a philosophical cousin mythos that chroniclers dare only speak of in the most heavily warded scriptoriums. They call this spectral legend the Crimson Crucible. It is an entirely theoretical construct, an alternate dimension of pure and distilled conflict whispered of by heretic savants and eccentric historians alike. In this phantom reality, the endless sprawling wars of the galaxy are not fought with massed artillery, void ship broadsides or orbital bombardments. Instead, all disputes of blood, territory and racial honor are settled entirely upon the blood-soaked pitch. It is a chilling thought experiment that strips away the incomprehensible logistics of our endless crusade, leaving only the raw, visceral truth of localized, intimate slaughter. Maddened sages postulate a universe where towering greenskins, arrogant Aeldari, and even the foul servants of the ruinous powers temporarily put aside their bolters and chainswords. In this twisted mirror realm, these bitter enemies resolve their ancient hatreds through a singular apocalyptic game. The ball itself becomes the ultimate indifferent arbiter of fate. To the strictly logical mind of the Inquisition, such an existence is utter heresy, a profane mockery of the God Emperor's absolute mandate for total galactic conquest. Yet the sheer psychic weight of this mythos endures, festering like an unhealing wound in the collective unconscious of humanity. The legend speaks of a time when the gridiron was the only battlefield that truly mattered. It tells of roaring, uncountable crowds who demanded blood and sacrifice just as fervently as any merciless planetary governor demands an imperial tithe. This myth represents a terrifying purity of violence, constrained within painted lines and enforced by arbitrary referees, yet no less lethal than the corpse-choked trenches of 1,000 war-torn worlds. This ancient memory of ritualized butchery serves as the dark philosophical foundation for the brutal games we tolerate today. The underlying principle of this corrupted legend has not been ignored by those who gaze down upon the teeming masses from their gilded spires. There is a profound manipulative power in the idea that unfettered cosmic fury can be channeled, contained, and weaponized within the strict confines of a stadium. Such noble myths of sporting honor do not survive the suffocating altitude of the imperial aristocracy. Far above the choking smog of the lower levels, suspended in geostationary luxury platforms, the rulers of humanity watch the blood flow. Here, planetary governors and subsector dukes recline on imported Grox hide loungers, sipping centuries-old amasec from crystalline flutes. They gaze down upon vast, anti-gravity arenas that float like gilded jewels in the void. Within these frictionless domes, the competitors are not heroes born of noble struggle, but vat-grown abominations. Cloned gladiators, gene-bulked and pumped full of aggressive combat stims, tear each other to bloody ribbons in zero gravity simply to capture a heavy iron grav-ball. Bones shatter against adamantium bulkheads, and synthetic blood boils in the artificial atmosphere, all for the fleeting amusement of those who hold dominion over billions. Yet the true horror of these orbital spectacles lies not in the slaughter on the pitch, but in the casual atrocities whispered in the viewing galleries. These lords of the segmentums do not gamble with mere planetary currency. They are utterly consumed by a decadent boredom that can only be pierced by gambling with the very infrastructure of the Imperium. A single goal, scored over the mangled corpse of a cloned defender, can transfer the ownership of an entire hive city. I have read the archived ledgers detailing planetary tithes doubled because a careless lord wagered against a rival house and lost. They trade the unfathomable outputs of Prometheum manufactorums as if they were nothing but trifling trinkets. Worse still is their callous exchange of loyal human lives. Entire army groups of the Astra Militarum, millions of faithful guardsmen waiting in the orbital docks for deployment, are signed away on an emerald datapad to cover a bad bet. Soldiers who swore a sacred oath to bleed for the Golden Throne are instead bartered away to distant war zones because a bored aristocrat favoured one local syndicate over a rival guild. It is a staggering, sickening hubris. They treat the Emperor's sacred currency of human life as mere gambling chips in a grand, grotesque parlour game. The sport at this terrifying pinnacle of imperial society has absolutely nothing to do with the game itself. It is a naked, arrogant display of absolute political power. It is the manifestation of a ruling class so utterly detached from the holy struggle of human survival that they require mass death simply to cure their profound lethargy. They watch the carnage from behind polarized armor glass, insulated from the cries of the dying and the starvation of the uncounted masses below. When the final klaxon sounds and the arena is hosed clean of gore, the aristocrats simply adjust their silk robes and prepare for the next match. But this insatiable thirst for violent spectacle cannot be contained solely within the gilded cages of the elite. The hunger for surrogate warfare trickles down through the decaying strata of society, mutating into something far more raw and desperate by the time it reaches the darkest, most unforgiving abysses of the imperial penal system. The grotesque wages of the spire nobility require a constant influx of desperate flesh to feed the grinding machinery of the arenas. Far beneath the gilded betting houses, within the lightless holds of imperial penal colonies, the Adeptus Astartes oversee a much darker variant of the blood sport. Here, in the forgotten bellies of the hive, the penal leagues are born. Convicted heretics, unrepentant murderers and mutineers are stripped of their chain-gang rags and bolted into heavy, spiked carapace armor. Before they are thrust into the blinding lumens of the pitch, the prison magistrates offer them a singular, shining covenant. They are promised a full and absolute pardon if they can merely survive a single season of Grav-Ball. It is a potent, intoxicating lie. In the grim darkness of the Imperium, hope is not a virtue but a carefully weaponized tactic. The promise of freedom forces these condemned souls to fight with a savage, feral ferocity that entertains the masses and enriches the masters. Yet the ledgers of the Arbites are written in blood, and no pardon has ever been stamped upon a murderer's brow. If by some dark miracle a penal team dominates their bracket, their reward is never liberty. They are simply fed to vastly superior, augmented opponents, or they are quietly executed in the locker room shadows for the crime of overreaching their lowly station. The true horror of the penal leagues is best understood by observing the final match of the Scintillant Dregs, a brutal syndicate of captured hive-gangers. These tattooed killers fought their way to what they believed was the championship bout, tearing through rival convict teams with jagged grave rackets and shattered shin guards. Midway through the grueling final half, bathed in their own sweat and the blood of their foes, the gangers noticed a chilling detail. The massive adamantium doors of the arena egress were not guarded, but entirely welded shut. Sparks fell from the high gantries as servitors sealed the final vents. There was never meant to be a victor. Through the crackling vox horns, a Lex Mechanic addressed the screaming, panicking players, his voice a drone of cold, imperial efficiency. He calmly explained that their sport was merely a highly efficient, self-regulating method of mass execution, designed to purge the hive of its filth while simultaneously entertaining loyal citizens. The gangers were left to tear each other apart in the sealed dome until starvation, exhaustion, and infected wounds claimed the very last survivor. It is a cruelty so profound that it borders on the absurd. Yet the Imperium does not indulge in such systematic slaughter merely for the sake of amusement. Every drop of blood spilled on the plasteel flooring serves a much higher, far more fanatical purpose. The slaughter of the condemned upon the grav plates is not merely a spectacle of physical extermination, it is a meticulously sanctioned liturgy. The Adeptus Ministorum suffers no idle hands within the Imperium of man, nor does it permit the existence of idle amusements. To ensure that the souls of the citizenry remain tethered to the master of mankind, the Ecclesiarchy has utterly consumed the sport of Grav-Ball. These sprawling arenas are no longer mere stadiums. They are grand cathedrals of ferrocrete and plasteel, their towering grandstands draped in miles of holy parchment bearing righteous scripture. Colossal purity seals, their parchment banners trailing for hundreds of meters, hang suspended above the scoring rings, their wax stamped with the icons of martyred saints. In this consecrated space, the mechanics of the game are transformed into a holy mass. Every goal scored is loudly dedicated to the God Emperor, a kinetic offering sent upward to the heavens. Conversely, an infraction is never treated as a simple foul. To break the rules upon a sanctified pitch is to commit an act of spiritual defiance, punished immediately and brutally as outright heresy by the judging arbiters. Along the blood-slicked sidelines, Ministorum priests pace with the manic energy of caged predators. They swing heavy iron censers that belch thick clouds of sacred incense, attempting to mask the coppery stench of vaporized gore and burnt ozone. Acting as zealot coaches for their respective congregations, they scream through gilded voxcasters, leading the roaring crowds in deafening synchronized chants. These are the litanies of kinetic impact. They are prayers sung to bless the crushing momentum of the players and to damn the shattered bones of the unrighteous. When a monolithic enforcer delivers a devastating tackle that splinters a mutant's spine against the grav barrier, the audience does not merely cheer the violence, they worship. To the Ecclesiarchy, such unrestrained brutality is a deeply holy act of purification. It is the execution of the aberrant and the heretical masquerading as athletic prowess. Thus does the imperial cult weaponize leisure itself. The Ministorum ensures that every gasped breath, every droplet of sweat, and every litre of blood spilled upon the pitch serves as a mandatory devotion to the Golden Throne. There is no escape from faith, even in the fleeting guise of a game. This perfect synthesis of zealous devotion and absolute violence begs a much darker consideration. What occurs when the parameters of this game are pushed to their absolute logical extremes? Consider a scenario where the arena expands beyond the confines of a single hive city, and the stakes are elevated from the executions of lowly prisoners to the ultimate survival of an entire planetary population. Let us delve into this dark hypothesis. Thus we have witnessed how humanity vents its inherent violence upon the domestic pitches of a million worlds. But let us now indulge in a sanctioned macro-cogitation, a mental exercise forged within the deepest analytical engines of the Ordo Xenos and the Ordo Hereticus. I ask you to envision the impossible. Imagine a singular pause in the eternal slaughter that consumes our galaxy. Picture a moment where the endless barrages fall silent, where the roaring chainswords are powered down, and the terrible warp storms momentarily calm. I ask you to consider what would happen if the existential conflicts of the 41st millennium were not decided amidst the burning ruins of hive cities, but upon the uncompromising geometry of a universal gridiron. If the brutal sport of Grav-Ball can distill the indomitable spirit of the Imperial Guard and the post-human fury of the Adeptus Astartes, we must calculate how the abhorrent Xenos and the wretched traitor would adapt to its rigid parameters. We must simulate if the arrogant Eldar would bring their sickening agility to the pitch, turning a simple match into a lethal dance of psychic deception. We must theorize if the insatiable hunger of the Tyranid swarm could be contained within a set of strict boundaries, driven by the hive mind to secure the objective rather than consume the flesh of the spectators. Consider the savage Orks, degenerate creatures born solely for battle, finding their ultimate nirvana in a game where extreme physical trauma is not merely permitted, but enthusiastically celebrated. And we must ponder the arch-enemy, the ruinous powers of chaos, who would surely attempt to pervert the sacred rules of the sport to test their dark gifts against the righteous armor of the Emperor's chosen. I assure you, faithful listener, that this is purely a theoretical projection. It is a strictly quarantined thought experiment designed to dissect the martial doctrines of our myriad foes within the absolute confines of a regulated blood sport. To actually fraternize with the Xenos or the heretic is the ultimate treason, a sin punishable by complete and fiery purgation. Yet to safely simulate their psychological and physical paradigms upon a standardized field of play is a vital strategic necessity. By confining the horrors of the galaxy to a pitch of measured yards and codified violence, we expose the underlying truths of their twisted warfare. We strip away the unpredictable variables of the vast cosmos and force the enemy to reveal their raw tactical essence. This immense macro-cogitation forms the foundational architecture of what we shall call the Grand League. It is a hypothetical theatre of unimaginable carnage, governed by an unbreakable framework that no species can defy. The pitch becomes a pure crucible where combat doctrine is tested not by cowardly orbital bombardment, but by the shattering, intimate impact of shoulder against chest plate. To construct such a colossal and blasphemous simulation requires much more than mere logic engines and historical data. It requires a mind capable of bridging the madness of the warp with the cold calculus of the gridiron. It demands a singular architect, a visionary of violence who possesses the terrifying will to compel the most hateful factions in existence to step onto the very same field. To manifest such an impossible contest required a mind untethered from the rigid dogma of the Adeptus Terror. It required the boundless resources and terminal arrogance of Rogue Trader Erasmus Vane. He was a titan of commerce whose private fleets eclipsed the naval armadas of entire sectors. Within his gilded vaults rested a warrant of trade ancient beyond reckoning, its vellum sealed with a single drop of the master of mankind's own blood. Such a document granted Vane the ultimate sanction to tread where angels and inquisitors dared not walk. Yet for all his unimaginable wealth and untouchable status, Vane suffered from the most insidious poison known to the mortal elite. He was fundamentally and hopelessly bored. Erasmus Vane had watched entire planetary systems burn and witnessed the death of countless worlds. He had purchased the submission of rebellious planetary governors with pocket change and commanded mercenary armies in wars that spanned generations. He had tasted the flesh of extinct leviathans and collected the crowns of shattered Xenos empires. There was no thrill left in the galaxy to quicken his pulse, no wonder remaining that he had not already bought, catalogued and discarded. This profound emptiness birthed a desperate hubris. He no longer wished to merely participate in the grand tapestry of the cosmos. He desired to weave it himself, to bend the absolute extremes of the galaxy to his personal amusement. Driven by this suffocating ennui, the rogue trader ventured into the lawless fringes of the halo stars to orchestrate an unthinkable parley. Aboard his flagship, hidden within a nebula of dead light, Vane hosted architects of terror and ancient lords of unreality. Through blasphemous Xenos artifacts and forbidden Astra telepathy, Vane reached across the void to bargain with the shadows. He cast a reality-bending wager into the dark, projecting his voice into the Imperium and the Webway alike to declare a tournament of absolute supremacy. It was a bet cast in the currency of souls, planetary domains, and cosmic supremacy. Vane promised a spectacle that would eclipse the squabbles of the Long War, a tournament of champions drawn from every blood-soaked corner of the galaxy. He believed he could control the primordial forces of the galaxy just as easily as he manipulated the trade conglomerates of the Segmentum Solar. He saw the factions of this dark millennium not as existential threats, but as gladiators performing for his singular delight. But arrogance of this magnitude always acts as a beacon in the Imperium. Such overwhelming pride invariably invites the gaze of the ruinous powers, drawing the hungry eyes of the warp toward the architect of the grand game. Before the bloodletting could commence, before the pawns could be moved across this celestial board, Vane required a stage worthy of his catastrophic vision. To host a confluence of gods, monsters and demigods without instantly collapsing into pure annihilation, the architect needed a battleground that defied the laws of nature. To host a spectacle of such apocalyptic magnitude, Lord Vane required a theatre worthy of his boundless arrogance. He found his stage in the Trivium system, resting upon the celestial corpse known as Trivium Prime. Once it had been a quiet tomb, a lifeless and atmosphere-stripped moon drifting in the cold void, utterly devoid of strategic or spiritual value. Under the reckless ambition of its new master, this silent sphere was violently awakened and transformed into a monolithic monument to human hubris. Where the Adeptus Mechanicus would have seen only barren dust, Vane saw a blank canvas for his madness. He deployed forbidden archaeotech, ancient terraforming engines that groaned with the chained fury of the dark age of technology, to rend the crust of the dead world. Mountains were shattered and tectonic plates fused together to carve an entire continent into a single colossal stadium. The sheer logistical horror of the endeavour defies all rational comprehension. Resources that could have equipped 100 crusades or fortified an entire sector were instead bled dry to construct a mere sporting field. Millions of labourers perished in the crushing gravity and airless wastes, their frozen corpses ground into the very foundation of the arena. The grandstands themselves were gouged directly out of the planetary bedrock, rising in jagged, terraced tiers that pierced the black sky. These petrified bleachers were designed to hold no living spectators. Instead, they were seeded with billions of servitor-linked picked thieves, an endless ocean of lobotomized cyborgs hardwired into a massive astro-telepathic array. Through their lifeless, mechanical eyes, the tournament would be broadcast across the turbulent Imperium to every hive world, war zone, and noble estate in the galaxy. It was a display of technological heresy and unchained vanity, consuming the psychic agony of thousands of sanctioned psychers just to maintain the transmission. At the heart of this planetary atrocity lay the pitch itself. It was not a field of soil or synth grass, but a hyperdense slab of forged adamantium, thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment. Beneath this indestructible surface, Vane embedded overlapping networks of macro-scale void shield generators. These were localized defense grids stolen from the hulls of dismantled Emperor-class battleships, repurposed solely to contain the inevitable destruction that would unfold upon the playing surface. The shielding was calibrated to keep the catastrophic energies of the game locked within the arena, ensuring that the annihilation of the players remained an enclosed, perfectly observable spectacle. Trivium Prime had been resurrected from the silence of the void only to scream. A dead world was now a colossal theatre of war disguised as a game, waiting for the blood of Xenos, heretics and champions to stain its indestructible floor. The stage was set, paid for in blood, steel, and monumental waste. Yet the grandest stadium in the cosmos was useless without competitors. Lord Vane now faced an impossible task, one that would require him to reach into the darkest corners of the galaxy to summon its most hostile and uncompromising nightmares. With the grand arena of blood and iron finally forged, Lord Vane required combatants to fill his vast theatre of ruin. He gathered an astropathic choir of 100 bound psychers, chaining them within the sensory deprivation vaults of his flagship. At his uncompromising command, they screamed a singular unified challenge into the churning malevolent tides of the Imperium. It was a psychic gauntlet thrown across the stars, a broadcast of such terrifying magnitude that it shattered the fragile minds of the very astropaths who sang it. One by one, their cranial vaults ruptured under the sheer pressure of the warp transmission. their eyes burning out from the inside until the entire choir was reduced to a blackened mass of smoking husks. Yet the brutal sacrifice achieved its grim purpose as the summons breached the raging warp storms and rippled outward into the darkest corners of the galaxy. Vane was a creature of immense cunning, understanding perfectly that a singular plea would never compel the warring masters of the cosmos to halt their endless crusades. The invitations were meticulously tailored baits, engineered to exploit the fatal flaws and ancient prides of every targeted species. For the inscrutable and arrogant Aeldari, his bound herald demons planted a heavily manipulated prophecy deep within the labyrinthine strands of the psychic skein. Their isolated farseers read the portents of a pivotal nexus of fate, a localized tournament where the survival of their dying, fragmented race hung entirely upon their victory. To the fiercely proud lords of the Imperium of Man, Vane broadcast a vicious, undeniable threat to their martial honor. He openly dared the sacred Adeptus Astartes and the hammer of the Astra Militarum to prove the absolute supremacy of mankind on his pitch, lest they be forever branded as cravens by a mere renegade. Far across the eastern fringe, the expanding Tau Empire received a radically different form of summons. A formal, heavily encrypted datapad was delivered directly to the sanctums of the ethereal caste, presenting the bloody tournament as an elegant diplomatic theatre and a supreme opportunity to demonstrate the undeniable, harmonious logic of the greater good. To any rational observer, this invitation was an act of unmitigated arrogance and sheer, unadulterated madness. Lord Vane had essentially cast bleeding bait into the deepest voids of a hostile, unforgiving universe, foolishly asking its apex predators to feast in peace at the same table. He demanded that ancient Xenos intellects, fanatical zealots, and genetically engineered killing machines lay down their planet-shattering campaigns to obey the arbitrary rules of a mortal referee, to invite the most ravenous terrors of the void into a single confined space was to invite absolute annihilation upon himself. Yet the pride of the galaxy is a fatal and blinding contagion, and no reigning warlord could resist the siren call of establishing their undeniable supremacy. As the majestic fleets of the ancient and the righteous shifted their warp routes toward Vane's colossal stadium, a far less sophisticated species caught the scent of the impending slaughter. Deep within the squalid, roaring rust yards of their ramshackle empires, the true, natural athletes of the cosmos felt an irresistible itch beneath their thick green skin. They cared nothing for planted prophecies, they required no elegant datapad missives, and they scoffed at the very concept of martial honor. They heard only the simple, beautiful promise of a massive brawl, an endless carnival of breaking bones and roaring crowds that drew their crude armadas toward the coordinates. The astropathic choirs of the Imperium had barely ceased their screaming when the galaxy spat its first response. While other races plotted or pondered the implications of the invitations, the greenskins required no such deliberation. To an orc, the promise of a localized, structured brawl is the ultimate narcotic. They needed no grand cosmic bait, no complex ideological reasoning, and certainly no promises of wealth to draw them to the pitch. The mere rumor of a team bloodsport was enough to ignite an immediate and terrifying planetary migration across the stars. The void above Trivium Prime soon darkened with the thick soot and burning exhaust of a ramshackle armada. Massive orc cruisers, welded together from the ruined husks of 1,000 conquered vessels, crashed recklessly into the designated parking orbits. They cared nothing for void collision protocols or safe navigational distances. Instead, they slammed into one another with joyous metallic crunches that showered the upper atmosphere of the world with burning debris. From the rusted bellies of these leviathans poured the roaring tides of the greenskin hordes, already riled into a frenzy of anticipation. They had taken to the concept of sporting attire with a terrifying crude enthusiasm. Their massive, muscle-bound frames were draped in hastily painted scrap metal that proudly denoted their chosen team colors. Slabs of stolen tank armor and cured Grok's hide were smeared in clashing pigments, chaotic checkered patterns, and jagged totems of their brutal gods. Some wore hollowed-out engine cowlings as crude shoulder pads, while others hammered spiked iron directly into their own green flesh to demonstrate their fanatical devotion to the game. As a chronicler of this dark epoch, I am compelled to point out the horrifying synergy at play upon this blood-stained pitch. To the Xenos Ork, the chaotic culture of hive pit rioting and their own natural biological imperative are the exact same thing. They do not play the game to win territory, nor do they care for the political dominance so desperately sought by the other empires. They play because the unbridled violence, the roaring crowds, and the sheer intoxicating chaos of the melee are the truest expressions of their fungal souls. There is simply no distinction between the fanatical, rioting supporter and the bloodthirsty combatant within their brutish society. This intrinsic, violent connection makes the Greenskins the absolute purest participants in the entire league. They are utterly unburdened by rigid tactical doctrine or the paralyzing fear of death. They seek only the ecstatic high of crushing a rival's skull beneath a heavy, studded cleat, laughing as the blood paints the turf. Their deafening war cries shook the very foundations of the grand stadiums, a rising tide of pure green joy that threatened to drown out the silence of the stars. Yet even as the crude roars of the Orks echoed across the broken ferrocrete, a far more elegant and ancient shadow was slipping quietly into the star system. The savage, deafening jubilation of the Greenskins was about to be met by a chillingly disciplined and arrogant grace. The deafening roar of the Greenskin horde had barely faded before a cold and haughty silence descended upon the eastern gates. Out of the shimmering haze of localized webway portals stepped the Asuryani, the tragic and arrogant children of a dying race. They did not march into the arena of Trivium Prime with the feral joy of the beasts that preceded them, nor with the dogmatic fervor of humanity. Instead, they moved with a reluctant grace, burdened by the terrible weight of prophetic purpose. At their vanguard stood the Farseers, their minds navigating the treacherous skeins of fate. These ancient seers had plucked a single thread from the cosmic tapestry. They had foreseen that a solitary goal scored upon this blood-soaked pitch would trigger a cascade of improbable events, ultimately sparing a verdant maiden world from utter annihilation 3 centuries hence. It is a bitter irony that such a transcendent species must subject themselves to so base an endeavor to secure their survival. To achieve this destined victory, the shrines of Cain stepped forward. Warriors who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of slaughter as howling banshees and striking scorpions were commanded to adapt their lethal disciplines to a crude human game. Though they wore lighter variants of their aspect war gear for maximum mobility, their ceremonial war masks remained securely affixed, locking their psyches safely away from the horrors they were bound to inflict. Stripped of their traditional power swords and biting chainswords, they remained terrifyingly lethal, transforming the raw athleticism of the sport into a hypnotic dance of flawless execution. Every sprint, every pivot, and every calculated strike was executed with an agonizing perfection born of 1,000 years of martial devotion. Yet beneath their breathtaking elegance burned a profound and suffocating disgust. To the Aeldari, the grand stadium of Trivium Prime was nothing more than a barbaric slaughterhouse, reeking of sweat, promethium, and the ignorant savagery of lesser races. They looked upon the cheering throngs with absolute contempt. Of their own foresight, trapped by invisible strings of fate that compelled them to participate in a theatre of Monkey. Every movement was a profound insult to their dignity, a necessary humiliation endured only for the sake of their unborn descendants. They moved across the brutalized turf without leaving a single footprint, their minds entirely detached from the visceral horror of their surroundings. Yet even the supreme arrogance of the craft-worlders faltered as the psychic winds began to shift within the arena. The Farseers suddenly clutched their rune-encrusted staffs, their minds gripped by a paralyzing dread. The delicate threads of destiny they had so carefully followed were violently unraveling, consumed by a suffocating shadow that blotted out the light of the warp. A terrifying psychic static clawed at the edges of their consciousness, radiating a monstrous hunger from the void above. The graceful athletes froze on the bloodied grass, their unmatched agility rendered utterly useless in the face of an approaching doom that knew nothing of fate, prophecy, or pride. Something completely devoid of thought or soul was descending upon the stadium, an endless swarm drawn inexorably toward the scent of concentrated biomass. Where the Aeldari stepped onto the bloody pitch, driven by the tangled threads of destiny, the great Devourer was drawn by a far simpler, far baser compulsion. To compel the galactic apex predator to participate in a mere blood sport requires a grim ingenuity. Lord Vane understood that the Tyranid cannot be bribed, threatened, or reasoned with. It can only be fed. Deep beneath the gladiatorial stadium, Vane constructed labyrinthine holding pens filled with immense churning vats of concentrated liquefied biomass. It was a treasure trove of genetic material, a feast vast enough to tempt the void-faring leviathans. To signal this horde across the cold expanse of space, he chained thousands of captured Genestealer cultists within the pitch-black catacombs. By subjecting a captive Genestealer patriarch to continuous calculated torment, Vane weaponized its broodmind, forcing a frantic, unified psychic resonance into the Imperium. The hive node screamed to its star-born saviors in unified agony. It was a homing beacon burning in the nightmare dimension, and a passing splinter fleet eagerly answered the call. The beasts that descended to the ash-choked pitch were not athletes. They were a bespoke slaughter brood, birthed from the acidic wombs of a vanguard bioship to conquer this exact planetary perimeter. Sleek, predatory leapers stalked the forward lines with twitching mandibles, their muscles coiled like biological springs. Behind them, towering Tyranid warriors formed an impenetrable phalanx of hardened chitin, bone swords and scything talons. Every organism moved without ego, without fear, and without individuality. Their collective consciousness was anchored by a pulsating synapse creature looming passively on the sidelines. This overseeing horror did not bark desperate orders or scream for martial glory like a mortal commander. It simply radiated the crushing Xenos will of the hive, directing its living weapons with the chilling synchronicity of a single terrible mind. The true horror of this spectacle was that the hive mind did not understand the concept of a game. The roaring millions in the grandstands, the painted boundary lines and the prestige of the tournament meant absolutely nothing to the shadow in the warp. The Xenos intelligence perceived the pitch only as a complex puzzle. The match itself was merely a biological algorithm to be solved. The hive mind recognized that carrying the heavy null sphere into the designated goal zone was the specific sequence of actions required to unlock the subterranean vaults of biomass. Placing the sphere was simply the key turning in a lock. The opposing players were categorized not as rivals, but as organic obstacles to be calculated, harvested, or completely bypassed. The swarm played with absolute cold efficiency. It sacrificed its own lesser drones without a sliver of hesitation, dispassionately throwing bodies onto the blades of the enemy if the geometry of the slaughter advanced the sphere by a single inch. It was a terrifying spectacle of cosmic starvation channeled into a tactical grid. Yet setting loose such ravenous Xenos horrors alongside proud ancient empires and blood-mad gladiators upon a single field presented an apocalyptic hazard. If the fragile structure of the contest shattered, the arena would instantly devolve into an uncontainable planetary massacre. Someone or something had to enforce the boundaries. To impose order upon a crucible boiling with the galaxy's most savage breeds requires an enforcement mechanism born of absolute nightmare. The pitch is a churning cauldron of predatory instincts, where untethered Ork brutality meets Aeldari arrogance and the ravenous hunger of the Tyranid swarm. Any standard attempt at arbitration would be reduced to bloody paste in a matter of seconds. Thus, the organizers unleash the Arbitrators of Trivium. These are no mere mortal umpires, but towering, heavily armored suppression striders forged in the darkest, forgotten vaults of the Inquisition. Strapped deep within their humming, adamantine chassis are shackled pariahs, wretched blanks harvested from the black ships. These pilots are living voids in the Imperium, bearing the cursed pariah gene that makes them anathema to all living things. From their armored pulpits, these blanks project a suffocating, localized aura of pure existential dread across the blood-soaked turf. The oppressive weight of their soullessness chokes the air, utterly nullifying any attempt at warp-based cheating or unnatural manipulation. An orc weirdboy finds his volatile green magic dissolving into painful, brain-boiling static before a single spell can be cast. An Aeldari farseer is violently blinded to the twisting strands of fate, reduced to a shivering, nauseous mortal by the agonizing psychic static. Even the formidable Tyranid synapse connection is violently suppressed under the smothering shadow of the pariahs, forcing the beasts to rely entirely on base, feral instinct. Yet this agonizing psychic nullification is only the first layer of this terrifying sporting lore. Suspended from the colossal inner vaults of the stadium canopy, a ring of ancient macro-lance platforms maintains absolute, unwavering target locks upon the pitch. These celestial executioners are governed by merciless hypercogitators, programmed to respond to the slightest physical infraction of the sacred rules. Should a player attempt to draw a concealed poison blade, activate an illegal energy matrix, or manifest an unapproved bioweapon, the retribution is instantaneous and absolute. A lance of blinding, concentrated orbital fire will pierce the heavens, vaporizing the offending creature and scorching the very earth before their weapon can even clear its sheath. The tension upon the pitch becomes a suffocating physical weight. Every participant understands that the fragile parameters of this game are held in place only by the hovering threat of sudden, overwhelming exterminatus. There are no warnings, no second chances, and absolutely no appeals to the towering judges. To step onto this field is to dance upon the razor edge of annihilation, overseen by soulless machines driven by walking voids. The thin line of order is maintained not by mutual respect or honor, but by the absolute guarantee of total obliteration. The vast crowds hold their collective breath, sensing the catastrophic violence vibrating just beneath the surface of the pitch. The players grind their teeth against the sickening psychic agony radiating from the towering arbitrators. All eyes turn toward the center of the arena, waiting for the ceremonial signal to unleash the carnage. The mechanism of commencement is no simple ringing trill. The whistle is a localized sonic boom, an earth-shattering detonation of pure acoustic force that ruptures the silence and rattles the very bones of the spectators. As the concussive shockwave rolls across the stadium, the fragile illusion of peace shatters, clearing the way for the inevitable shedding of first blood. The grand procession onto the macro pitch was intended to be a display of martial pageantry, but it instantly devolved into a crucible of barely contained hatred. The factions of the galaxy marched shoulder to shoulder under the glare of artificial suns. Space Marines in sacred ceramite held their positions mere paces from where the chitinous monstrosities of the Tyranid hive fleets strained against their stasis fields. Traitor Astartes, draped in flayed skin, exchanged wordless promises of murder with the black-clad zealots of the Black Templars. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of adrenaline and the psychic static of pure malice. It took less than 3 standard minutes for the friction to ignite. Deep within the mass of converging teams, a Drukhari gladiator moved with silken grace, slipping a neuro-gauntlet tipped with a homunculus brood phantasm toxin toward the exposed flank of an orc nob. The strike was invisible to the mortal eye, but the orc did not require sight to feel the sudden sting of venom. With a guttural roar of primordial fury, the greenskin pivoted and clamped its massive tusked jaws around the arm of the Dark Eldar. Bone shattered and sinew tore as the orc severed the limb entirely, swallowing it in a spray of Xeno's blood. The crowd surged, anticipating a full-scale slaughter, but the response of the arbitrators was absolute and instantaneous. Before the severed stump could even hit the sanctified permacrete of the pitch, the heavens split open. Twin columns of blinding incandescent fury struck from the orbital defense platforms directly above the stadium. The stadium's automated thermal lances incinerated the Ork and the Drukhari simultaneously, leaving nothing behind but two smoking silhouettes permanently burned into the pitch. Silence fell over the arena like a shroud of lead. The galaxy watched as the ashes of the offenders were swept away by the atmospheric scrubbers. There would be no appeals, no leniency, and absolutely no tolerance for unsanctioned bloodshed before the opening whistle. With the lethal severity of the rules demonstrably proven, the true spectacle commenced. The center of the colossal pitch groaned as interlocking blast doors retracted, revealing a subterranean launch silo. From the depths of the stadium, suspended by heavy grav chains, rose the match ball. It was a massive adamantium null sphere, forged in the fires of Mars and etched with wards of absolute stasis. The sphere slammed into the center circle with a seismic thud that rattled the teeth of every spectator across the continent. This was the prize, the instrument of victory, and the herald of unimaginable carnage. The silence stretched thin, pulling the collective sanity of the assembled legions to a razor edge. Then, the tension finally snapped. An exterminatus-grade siren shattered the quiet, a mournful and deafening wail that signaled the commencement of the ultimate blood sport. The grav plates beneath the pitch began to hum with terrifying power, shifting the very physics of the arena. In perfect, horrific unison, the greatest warriors of 1,000 burning worlds unleashed their pent-up physical might. Roaring war cries that drowned out the heavens, the entire galaxy charged forward in a tidal wave of armor, muscle and fangs, desperate to claim the first possession. As the null sphere struck the consecrated turf, the opening engagement of this grim crucible commenced. The Astra Militarum took the field against the burgeoning menace of the Tau Empire. For the hammer of the Emperor, military doctrine translates poorly to the constrained geometries of a regulatory sporting pitch. Their traditional reliance on overwhelming numbers and the ceaseless grinding of 1 billion boots is rendered entirely moot by the strict player count rules of the tournament. Deprived of their unending reinforcements, the Guard fielded a desperate bastion of meat and muscle. A colossal defensive line of abhuman ogrins anchored their formation, forming a literal wall of scarred flesh and slab-thick armor. Behind them, wiry Catachan runners prepared to carry the sphere, relying on nothing but sheer jungle-bred grit and the fanatical devotion of the Imperial infantrymen. To witness them was to witness the tragedy of the common human spirit. They were brave, they were stubborn, and they were wholly doomed. Across the center line stood the fire caste of the Tau, warriors bred for the crucible of combat and clad in lightweight composite plating. Where the Imperium sought to weather the storm through blunt defiance, the Xenos treated the pitch as a holographic simulation of war. They invoked the Kauyon, the doctrine of the patient hunter, seamlessly adapting their martial philosophy into a terrifying athletic playstyle. When the sphere was put into play, the Tau did not clash directly with the roaring Ogrin defensive line. Instead, they initiated a series of precise, mathematically perfect passing arrays. The sphere snapped between the hooved athletes in a dizzying lattice of calculated vectors. The Catachan runners, lungs burning and legs tearing with exertion, chased after shadows. With cold efficiency, the Tau drew the slow-witted Ogrins out of position, baiting the massive abhumans with lateral feints that exploited their aggressive instincts. Gaps appeared in the Imperial defense, and the Xenos surged through them like water flowing around jagged rocks. The guardsmen bled for every inch of the astrogranite, sacrificing their bodies in a desperate bid to halt the Xenos advance. Bones snapped under the weight of desperate tackles, and red blood stained the pitch, yet the Tau remained utterly pristine in their execution. The clinical precision of the Xenos left the veterans of 100 campaigns gasping in the dust. outmaneuvered by an enemy that did not hate them, but merely solved them like a biological equation. It was a systematic dismantling of imperial resilience, a clean victory for the Tau achieved through superior tactical geometry. Yet the roaring crowds of the Colosseum found no joy in such sterile perfection, hungering instead for a display of true and visceral devastation. They would not have to wait long, for the combatants taking the field for the second bout possessed a martial philosophy that was the absolute antithesis of clinical precision. While the previous spectacle demonstrated the bloodless calculus of the Xenos, the second match of the bracket offered a stark reminder of humanity's ultimate weapon. The Adeptus Astartes do not play games. When the composite Astartes strike force took to the blood-stained gridiron, they did not bring strategy intended to outmaneuver or outwit. They brought the absolute, terrifying physics of the Emperor's wrath made flesh. To witness a transhuman athlete in motion is to watch reality itself buckle under the strain of genetic perfection. These are beings weighing over a ton in full plate, yet they explode off the line of scrimmage with an acceleration that defies the laws of mass and inertia. When the opposing thrower desperately attempted a long pass to bypass the armoured line, the interception was not a mere athletic feat. It was an act of predatory violence. An Astartes vanguard launched his massive frame into the air, crossing 30 yards in a heartbeat to snatch the projectile from its apex with a gauntlet large enough to crush a mortal skull. What followed was the execution of a maneuver chronicled in the tactical codices as the Transhuman Blitz. The Astartes did not bother looking for open lanes or exploiting weaknesses in the enemy defense. They formed a solid wedge of midnight black ceramite and simply decided that the space occupied by the opposing team belonged to them. They drove forward in perfect, terrifying lockstep. There was no evasion, only the brutal application of overwhelming force. The sound of the impact was like a macro cannon shell making contact with a fortress wall. Thick enemy armor shattered into jagged shrapnel, and the sickening crunch of pulverized bone echoed through the stadium as the opposing line was instantly ground into red dust beneath massive armored boots. To the Space Marine, the ball itself is entirely secondary. The object they carry is merely a token of compliance. Their true objective is the systematic, methodical eradication of every living obstacle on the field. They do not run to the end zone to score points. They march forward to incapacitate the opposition until walking the ball across the goal line is nothing more than a quiet, uncontested formality amidst a field of ruined bodies. It was a display of martial supremacy so absolute that it silenced the roaring crowds, leaving only the wet, heavy thuds of giant strides crushing whatever remained in their path. Yet this flawless demonstration of biological engineering and righteous fury was but a prelude to a far grimmer test. The victorious loyalists wiped the gore from their visors only to look across the tournament bracket and see the shadows lengthening. Waiting for them in the next round were the twisted echoes of their own perfection, ancient traitors eager to prove that whatever the Emperor could build, the warp could break. With the transhuman blitz of the Adeptus Astartes leaving the arena scarred and smouldering, the pitch was immediately claimed by a far more primal juxtaposition of combatants. The third match pit the terrifying biological tide of the Ork Goths against the tragic elegance of the Aeldari from Craftworld Simhan. For the Greenskins, this grim contest was not a sport, but a glorious, unadulterated translation of their collective psychic energy into a brutal running game. They cared nothing for the complex physics of the Grav-Ball or the mandated rules of the arena. Instead, they relied upon their sheer, bloody-minded belief to bend the very laws of momentum to their will. A thrown ball did not arc according to gravity, but rather flew true simply because the beast believed it must. Arrayed against this tide of roaring green muscle were the howling banshees and swift strikers of the Asuriani. The Aeldari did not fight for the sheer joy of violence, but out of desperate, tragic necessity. An entire craft world had been wagered upon the outcome of this macabre tournament. binding the survival of millions to the blood-stained stadium floor. To save their dying race from further oblivion, the Eldar employed their innate precognition and immense physical agility. They did not merely react to the greenskin assaults, but anticipated them through the warp-touched skeins of fate. Aeldari players leapt and pirouetted through the air, their minds reading the future to elegantly intercept passes before the Orks had even decided to throw them. For a brief time it seemed that the refined foresight of the ancient empire might overcome the crude savagery of the encroaching horde. Then came the defining spectacle of the match. An Aeldari striker, moving with the breathtaking grace of a phantom, read the imminent flow of the game with absolute perfection. She positioned herself flawlessly to intercept a massive crossfield pass, her hands raised to steal the game-winning momentum. Yet she had calculated only the trajectory of the ball, failing to account for the sheer irrational madness of the Ork mentality. A towering Goth knob, his skin thick with scar tissue and war paint, completely ignored the descending Grav-Ball. He did not leap to catch the prize. He simply lowered his immense iron-jawed head and charged in a physics-defying burst of speed straight through the intercepting Aeldari. The impact was absolute and devastating. The Aeldari striker was instantly pulverized in a spray of crimson, her ancient soul flashing into her spirit stone a microsecond before the crushing collision reduced her mortal form to ruin. The Ork knob did not even break his stride as he caught the blood-slicked Grav-Ball on the bounce. He vaulted toward the scoring ring, screaming the eternal guttural war cry of his savage race, and slammed the sphere home with earth-shattering force. Elegant foresight had been utterly shattered by brute, unstoppable momentum. The surviving Asuriani collected their dead in stunned, mournful silence, their desperate gamble lost to the cruel whims of the galaxy. As the shattered remnants of Saimhan retreated into the shadows of the arena, the blood-stained pitch was left empty, waiting only for the cruelest of their dark kin to rise from the depths and take the stage. The brutal triumph of the Orks over the precognitive craft worlds demonstrated that no amount of foresight can halt a sufficient application of blunt force. Yet as the bloody spectacle of the tournament continued, another breed of elf found their own twisted methodologies entirely undone by the cold realities of the galaxy. The witch cults of Commorragh descended upon the pitch, seeking not mere victory, but a symphony of exquisite agony. To the dark kin, the Grav-Ball was never the true objective. It was merely bait, a cruel lure designed to draw their opponents into a labyrinth of barbed whips, poisoned blades, and sadistic hit-and-run maneuvers. They thirsted for the screaming terror of their prey to sustain their blackened souls. Instead, they faced the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Skitarii maniples deployed onto the arena floor not as individual athletes, but as a single, terrifyingly synchronized organism. Linked by the invisible data tethers of the no-O-sphere, the cyborgs executed plays of unfeeling calculus and perfect geometry. Passes were calculated to the millimeter. Moves were anticipated through pure algorithmic probability. High above the carnage, the officiating tech priest coach observed the match through a web of emerald tactical displays, coldly calculating the exact percentage of acceptable physical degradation required to secure triumph. This mechanical apathy profoundly infuriated the Drukhari. Every flesh-tearing strike that would have reduced a mortal man to a weeping ruin elicited only a brief burst of static from the Skitarii. Nerves had been severed. Pain receptors had been permanently lobotomized. The witches danced and slaughtered, yet they starved upon a barren feast of sparks and spilled neurofluid. The match devolved into a bizarre intersection of flawless logic and deep, agonizing boredom for the sadists of the Dark City. This utter incompatibility of philosophies culminated in a singular, breathtaking display of objective completion. An incensed Drukhari succubus, her pride wounded by such mechanical apathy, moved with terrifying grace to isolate and trap the Skitarii vanguard tasked with the sphere's transport near the Mechanicus goal line. She readied a master-crafted agonizer, intending to draw out the cyborg's death in a theatrical foul of unprecedented cruelty. She demanded a scream. The Skitarii offered only a binaric blur of combat logic. Acknowledging the absolute certainty of its own destruction, the cyborg instantaneously overrode its core self-preservation protocols. It did not attempt to flee. It simply overloaded the galvanic power cells within its bionic chassis. The ensuing detonation was immediate and spectacular. The catastrophic explosion vaporized the lower half of the Skitarii, instantly annihilating the gloating succubus in a shower of superheated shrapnel and dark Aeldari blood. More importantly to the watching tech priests, the precise kinetic shockwave of the blast propelled the Grav-Ball forward upon a flawless, unstoppable trajectory directly into the net. Victory was achieved not through passion, but through the ruthless, sacrificial sanctity of the machine. As the surviving Skitarii marched off the gore-slicked pitch without a single backward glance at their fallen, the servitors began scrubbing the arena floor. They prepared the bloodied grounds for the next slaughter, utterly unaware that the cold metal of the Mechanicus was about to be tested against an entirely Xenos, all-consuming biological nightmare. The machine-blessed blood of the Martian priesthood had barely seeped into the arena sands before a deeper, older dread took the field. Where the previous match was a testament to sadistic cruelty and mechanical sacrifice, the fifth contest was a grotesque collision of the soulless and the mindless. The Tyranid swarm poured onto the pitch in a chittering tide of hyper-evolving biology, driven by the cold synaptic will of the hive mind. Arrayed against them stood the unyielding silver ranks of the Necron Lich Guard, their silent phalanxes radiating an aura of ancient arrogance. High above the arena floor, the observing Necron overlord watched with profound aristocratic disgust. To his immortal dynasty, this tournament was a noble pursuit of the cosmos, now hopelessly sullied by the presence of chittering biological vermin. The match began as a slaughter. Hormagaunts and Gin-stealers hurled themselves blindly against the unbreakable Necron line, their scythes sparking uselessly against living metal. Yet the great Devourer does not play to win the opening skirmish. Every shattered carapace and severed limb was a calculated sacrifice, a horrific transmission of tactical data back to the synapse creatures. The hive mind was learning the precise kinetic rules of the Grav-Ball, mapping the defensive geometry of the undying phalanx through trial by death. On the very edges of the pitch, grotesque birthing sacs pulsed with accelerated gestation. The swarm was intentionally losing players to the Necron gauntlet, only to birth specialized biomorphs onto the sidelines mid-match. These fresh horrors emerged dripping with amniotic fluid, boasting hyperdense chitins specifically evolved to withstand Gauss flare fields, and elongated leaping legs calibrated to the exact height of the Lichguard shields. The Silver Legions of the Infinite Empire responded with the merciless efficiency of reanimation protocols. Whenever a genetically tailored Genestealer managed to tear the Grav-Ball through a gap in the phalanx, the Necron defenders simply knitted their necrodermis back together and marched forward. The arena became a grinding theatre of ultimate attrition, pitting the undying machine against the endlessly adaptable flesh. Then came the moment that shattered the very laws of reality. A specialized Tyranid vanguard broke through the defensive lines, sinking the Grav-Ball into the Necron goal with a sickening crunch of biological force. Refusing to accept this indignity, a Necron cryptek raised his chronomantic staff, channeling the cosmic powers of a chained star. Green energy flared, and time itself began to rewind. The cheering crowds watched in bewildered silence as the Grav-Ball flew backward out of the goal, the Tyranid striker retreating in reverse motion. The timeline began to stitch itself into a new, pristine configuration where the vermin had never scored. But the Tyranid superorganism is an endlessly adapting horror that defies even ancient physics. The hive mind reacted with terrifying instinct, deploying specialized zoanthropes to unleash pinpoint bioelectric shocks and a concentrated psychic scream, violently overwhelming the cryptek's engrammatic pathways before the chronomantic matrix could fully align. In that fractured microsecond of temporal lag, A lictor, previously camouflaged in the shadow of the arena walls, struck. It did not outpace time, but ruthlessly exploited the glitching timeline, impaling the cryptek and hurling the ball violently back into the goal. The paradox collapsed in an explosive shockwave of chronal energy, but the score remained. The aristocratic pride of the Necron overlord was broken by the sheer, terrifying adaptability of the Xenos swarm. The Undying Legion had commanded time itself, yet they could not halt the evolutionary inevitability of the Tyranid advance, a grim portent for whatever unfortunate souls awaited them in the final group stage clash. The creeping dread of the hive-mind evolutionary triumph over Necron chronomancy had barely settled before the stadium was violently dragged back into the spiritual warfare of the Horus heresy. Match 6 pitted the stubborn, unyielding anvil of the Adeptus Astartes against the howling nightmare of the ruinous powers. The Imperial fists stood upon the pitch like statues of unyielding, sanctified ceramite. Opposing them was an unholy alliance of world-eaters and emperor's children. The traitor Astartes did not merely play the game, they sought to butcher reality itself. The pitch immediately began to mutate under their spiked boots. Flesh-metal tendrils erupted from the sidelines. Reality-tearing fouls became their standard doctrine. Yet the Sons of Dawn remained entirely unfazed. To the Imperial fists, this was not a contest of athletic supremacy. It was a brutal exercise in absolute subjugation. They operated with the cold, unbreakable discipline of a chapter built for siege warfare, treating the match as a mere defensive hold. They are masters of the shield wall and synchronized strikes. Their actions aligned perfectly through psycho-indoctrinated drill, forming an immovable bastion of ceramite. Where the world-eaters charged in mindless frenzies, the stoic Imperial fists simply braced their stances by fractions of an inch. This allowed the berserkers to violently collide with one another against the impenetrable line. Where the Emperor's children sought to overwhelm the senses with agonizingly fast footwork, the yellow-clad Astartes intercepted them with clinical contempt. The absolute impotence of the warp against the Emperor's unyielding space marines drove the Chaos champions into apoplectic madness. In a desperate bid to shatter the unbreakable golden line, the forces of the arch-enemy resorted to outright possession. A summoned demonette of Slaanesh phased violently into the material realm. It instantly bound its essence to the heavy Grav-Ball. Screaming with warp-infused malice, the corrupted sphere altered its own trajectory. It hurtled backward toward the Imperial fist's net, intent on forcing an unstoppable own goal. It was a manifestation of pure, unpredictable warp sorcery. A veteran sergeant did not even break his stride. With a motion of cold, absolute transhuman efficiency, he raised his relic thunderhammer. He struck the screaming ball with the flat, crackling face of his hammer, the disruptive power field roaring upon impact. The impact was deafening. The catastrophic force, combined with the disruptive energy of the power field, shattered the demon's physical manifestation, banishing it back to the warp in a flash of dying violet light. Without pausing to watch his handiwork, the Astartes continued his patrol. The purified ball ricocheted off 3 separate retaining walls. It carved a mathematically perfect geometric path across the entire length of the mutated pitch. It struck the back of the Chaos net with the force of a macro-cannon shell. It was a flawless goal executed in one fluid, indifferent motion. The heretic Astartes fell into a state of feral, cannibalistic infighting. They were entirely broken by their inability to corrupt or even mildly inconvenience the stubborn loyalists. The match concluded exactly as the Imperial fists had calculated before the first whistle even blew. With this final display of terrifying martial supremacy, the group stages of this bloody tournament shuddered to a halt. The surviving factions had secured their advancements, leaving nothing behind them but corpses and ruined pride. We must now turn our grim attention to the analytical breakdown of the ensuing quarterfinals, where the true slaughter is destined to begin. The The stoic majesty of the Imperial fists still burned against the retina, their flawless execution of the arch-enemy signalling the brutal conclusion of the opening brackets. Yet the blood spilled by those golden demigods was merely a primer for the horrors to come. High orbit above Trivium Prime was choked with the void-shielded pleasure barges of the Imperial nobility. Within those velvet-lined sanctums, the proxies of the High Lords casually wagered the lives of billions, trading the tithes of entire subsectors upon the unpredictable slaughter unfolding below. They sipped amasec and laughed, completely detached from the visceral reality of the pitch. Down on the surface, the grand architect of this madness, Rogue Trader Erasmus Vane, sweated profusely beneath his powdered wigs and layers of protective flax silk. His majestic sporting spectacle was violently spiraling out of his control. The foundational architecture of the Trivium Prime mega-stadiums was physically degrading under the sheer kinetic fury of the tournament. Once pristine pitches of engineered turf had been churned into nightmarish trench networks of pulverized rockcrete, shattered armor, and coagulated gore. Beneath the ruined surface, catastrophic malfunctions in the arcane stadium machinery caused the localized grav plating to violently fluctuate. Entire sections of the midfield abruptly inverted into zero-gravity kill zones without warning. Players caught in these gravitational anomalies were left helpless, bleeding out in floating crystalline spheres of their own vitals as they drifted through the void. The screaming multitudes in the grandstands were no longer mere spectators. They had become collateral offerings to the dark altar of the sport. Stray mass-reactive bolter rounds and errant plasma discharges routinely decimated the lower seating tiers, vaporizing thousands of cheering citizens in a single roaring instant. The corpses were simply trampled by the frenzied survivors. This systemic butchery was the genesis of a grim tactical philosophy the strategic savants dubbed the attrition curve. The fundamental meta of the tournament had shifted from athletic dominance to raw endurance. Teams were no longer attempting to outscore their adversaries in any traditional sense. They were simply trying to survive the bracket. Victory was not measured in points on a lumen board, but in the heartbeats of the few scarred players left standing when the chronological cycle expired. Even the match officials were entirely consumed by the escalating savagery. The Lex arbitrators, sworn to uphold the sacred rules of the pitch, had long ago abandoned their ceremonial whistles. To enforce a simple offside violation or a holding penalty now required the sustained deployment of heavy bolters. These armoured judges stalked the sidelines like grim executioners, doling out immediate capital punishment for fouls and delays of game. It was a desperately necessary escalation, though ultimately a futile one, as more than half of the arbitrating guild had already been reduced to mechanized scrap and shredded meat by the very players they sought to control. The surviving teams were battered, depleted, and driven to the absolute brink of sanity. The quarterfinals loomed like a yawning abyss, promising a crucible of violence that would utterly dwarf the opening massacres. Erasmus Vane watched from his reinforced spire, dabbing blood-flecked sweat from his brow as the great mechanical displays ground into position for the first match of the bracket. The relentless, undying legions of the Necron dynasties stood motionless upon the blasted pitch, their metallic forms gleaming under the harsh stadium floodlights. Arrayed against them were the towering transhuman monoliths of the Adeptus Astartes, their power armor scarred, but their righteous resolve unbreakable. The deafening roar of the ceremonial horn sounded to commence the slaughter, echoing across a ruined arena waiting to be drowned in blood once more. With the facade of sanctioned rules completely shattered by the arena systemic collapse, the quarterfinal matches descended into naked wars of annihilation. The Adeptus Astartes found themselves matched against the ancient horror of the Necron dynasties, an opponent that had advanced through the preliminaries on a grim, bloodless technicality. Here, the unyielding attrition of the soulless machines met the pinnacle of Imperial shock assault. The composite strike force of White Scars and Raven Guard, abandoned any pretense of ground-level maneuvering. Igniting their jump packs, the sons of the Khan and of Korax transformed the Grav-Ball arena into a lethal, three-dimensional theatre of aerial supremacy. They pushed their transhuman physiology to the absolute breaking point, their twin hearts hammering against ceramite plates as they sought to outpace death itself. Below them, the Necron phalanxes did not run. They advanced with the slow, inevitable tread of a dying universe. The Xenos warriors established rigid lanes of passing, protecting the sphere not with speed, but with overlapping fields of emerald destruction. Gauss fire lashed upward, flaying the air at a molecular level. Every vector of approach was blanketed by energy that could strip an armored warrior down to his constituent atoms. Yet the high-mobility tactics of the Space Marines began to take their toll, fracturing the crystalline logic of the undying legions. The metallic constructs, so long accustomed to overwhelming resilience, finally began to crumble under the relentless, hyperkinetic fury of the angelic descents. The defining triumph of this brutal engagement was forged in a singular microsecond of ultimate sacrifice. An assault intercessor, clad in the midnight armor of the Raven Guard, plunged through a storm of emerald lightning with the Grav-Ball clutched to his chest. A concentrated Gauss beam intercepted his flight path, striking him dead center. His armor, his flesh, and his bones were vaporized in an instant of agonizing dissolution. Yet in the final fraction of a heartbeat before his soul joined the Emperor, he hurled the sphere upward. A White Scar's battle brother intercepted the pass at the apex of his own jump. Before him stood a Necron cryptech, raising a glowing chronometron to manipulate the time stream around his fallen vanguard. Displaying a mastery of tactical geometry that bordered on the divine, the White Scar did not strike the Xenos leader. Instead, he hurled the sphere directly into the localized gravitational and temporal distortion generated by the Xenos artifact. The strange spatial pull of the chronometron caught the Grav-Ball, accelerating it through a flawless slingshot trajectory. The sphere tore away from the chronomantic well at blinding speed, shattering the energy barriers of the Necron goal before the machines could even register the physical paradox. With that cataclysmic strike, the undying lines shattered completely, and the Astartes secured their passage into the semi-finals. Their victory stood as a testament to flesh, blood, and fury over eternal stagnation. Yet there was no time to mourn the vaporized martyrs of the Imperium. The next quarterfinal beckoned from the blood-soaked pitch, where a rising tide of roaring green muscle and chaotic scrap metal waited to unleash an entirely different breed of savagery upon the tournament. While the Adeptus Astartes had conquered the skies with the cold calculus of angels, the second quarterfinal descended into a theatre of absolute desecration. The Drukhari stepped onto the field flushed with the arrogant pride of their previous victory, having woven a web of labyrinthine points manipulation to secure their undeserved advancement. They expected to demonstrate their agonizing artistry once more, turning the pitch into a canvas of elegant and protracted cruelty. Instead, they found themselves facing a monstrous green tide that viewed this grand tournament not as a contest of athletic skill, but as a holy pilgrimage of supreme violence. The Orks did not simply play the game before them. They began to actively dismantle the ancient stadium itself. Screaming mech boys and cackling looters ignored the heavy iron ball entirely in the opening moments, tearing up the hallowed grav-tech plating of the arena floor with crude hydraulic claws. Through terrifying leaps of sheer greenskin scrap logic, they lashed these stolen anti-gravity generators directly to their spiked armor. This reckless desecration transformed lumbering brutes into erratic, screaming missiles of rusted metal and sparking wire. The Drukhari were utterly horrified by the spectacle unfolding before them. Their dark and refined sadism, perfected over millennia in the shadowed spires of Commorragh, was being humiliated by a display of blunt, comical barbarism. To survive the chaotic onslaught, the terrifying agility of the witch cults was brought to bear upon the ruined pitch. The Xenos gladiators moved like liquid shadows, attempting to outmaneuver the roaring behemoths by leaping off the makeshift scrap heaps the Orks had hurriedly built in the midfield. For a fleeting, beautiful sequence, the martial superiority of the Dark City seemed completely assured. A prime witch, clutching the ball to her spiked breastplate, danced through the center of the Orc defensive line with breathtaking grace. She was completely untouchable, pirouetting through the swinging blades and lunging jaws with the condescending perfection of an apex predator among slow beasts. She mocked the greenskins with every flawless evasion, closing in on the final line while the captive audience held its collective breath. But the Xenos horde possessed a devastatingly simple countermeasure to such pretentious agility. A towering big mech, his crude bionics sparking with erratic energy, locked the crosshairs of his jury-rigged shock attack gun upon the leaping dancer. He did not attempt to intercept her path or match her impossible speed. Instead, with a sickening crack of displaced reality, he fired a furious, warp-maddened snotling directly into the chest cavity of the witch. The graceful gladiator ruptured from the inside out in a grotesque shower of crimson fluid and shattered pale bone. Her elegant performance was violently terminated as she collapsed into the smoking turf. A massive green warrior casually stomped over her twitching remains, scooped up the bloodied ball in one massive fist, and trotted across the scoring threshold. The entire stadium shook with the deafening, roaring laughter of the Xenos horde. They had shattered the ancient arrogance of the Dark Kin with nothing but crude imagination and unfathomable brutality. Still bellowing their guttural war chants, the victorious monsters stomped gleefully toward the semi-finals, eagerly setting the stage for the most catastrophic meat grinder the bloody tournament had ever witnessed. The blood-slicked AstroTurf had barely ceased steaming from the Drukhari and Orc massacre before the third quarterfinal match commenced. The Tau Empire took the field against the dread traitors of the Chaos Space Marines. Guided by the cold calculus of their Fireblade commanders, the Tau executed a flawless Kauyon zone defense. Their Grav-Ball passing game was a marvel of mathematical perfection. The sphere danced between their fire warriors with synchronized grace, designed to draw the enemy into a fatal overextension. Yet logic holds no sway over the primordial ruin of the Imperium. The Firecast tacticians watched in absolute horrified disbelief as heretic Astartes completely ignored the physical geometry of the stadium. Chaos warp talons tore rents in the very fabric of reality to perform utterly illegal, trans-dimensional tackles. Screaming from the ether, they materialized inside the Tau formations, violently dismantling the precise Xenos' defensive lines in a storm of lightning claws and unholy laughter. Dark sorcerers upon the sidelines reveled in this slaughter, their foul incantations twisting the rules of the tournament into grotesque mockeries. The match reached its blasphemous conclusion when a champion of the ruinous powers seized the Grav-Ball and simply tore a hole into the warp. He dragged the artifact through hellscape dimensions, completely bypassing the desperate Tau goalie to deposit the sphere into the net from an impossible immaterial angle. Chaos claimed its victory not through skill, but through reality-breaking madness. The final quarterfinal match offered no respite from this descent into butchery. The valiant mortals of the Astra Militarum faced the apocalyptic swarm of the Tyranids. Knowing they could not match the biological horrors in speed or savagery, the Imperial Guard commanders ordered a classic Aegis Line defensive formation. Their strategy was simple and desperate. They sought to lock down the pitch, stall the clock, and deny the Xenos any avenue of approach. Ranks of heavily armored guardsmen locked their shields and braced their bodies around the goal zone. Against any mortal foe, this unyielding wall of Imperial grit might have held. But the Tyranid hive mind does not play games. It coldly adapted to the enclosed stadium geometry, analyzing the fleshy barricade with an Xenos hunger. The swarm deployed a towering Carnifex to act as a heavy striker. This living siege engine of chitin and muscle did not attempt to outmaneuver the Aegis Line. It lowered its massive scythe-like crest and bulldozed straight through the center of the Imperial formation. The impact was a cataclysm of shattered bones and crushed flak armor. The beast drove forward with unnatural momentum, grinding the brave defenders into the synthetic turf. In one final, terrifying surge of pure brute force, the Carnifex crushed the surviving guardsman, the goalie, and the Grav-Ball simultaneously into the back of the net. The quarterfinal bracket thus reached its bloody, devastating conclusion. The traitor legions and the great Devourer had secured their advancement. A terrifying truth now casts a long, dark shadow over the approaching semi-finals. In this brutal arena, enlightened strategies and disciplined defensive tactics are utterly failing. The mathematically precise and the brave alike are being ground into dust. We are bearing witness to the triumph of sheer, unnatural brute force, a harbinger of the unfathomable violence yet to come in the Final Four. The slaughter of the quarterfinals left only 4 Titans standing upon the blood-stained pitch. The first semi-final clash pitted the crude, roaring fury of the Xenos against the Emperor's finest. It was a fundamental conflict of philosophies as much as a physical brutalization. The Orc team deployed their infamous Green Tide offense. This was no mere strategy, but a chaotic, momentum-based stampede born of pure, primal savagery. Every greenskin player swarmed the Grav-Ball in a riotous frenzy, abandoning all pretense of positioning to drown the arena in a sea of howling muscle. They relied on the sheer psychic resonance of their unending war to carry the sphere toward the end zone, forming a moving mountain of violent green flesh. Standing against this tsunami of barbarism were the Adeptus Astartes. Where the Orks were an avalanche of anarchy, the Space Marines were the immovable bedrock of imperial order. They countered the Xenos mob with strict adherence to the Holy Codex Astartes, executing the transhuman Blitz. Every micro-movement was calculated, every firing lane and blocking vector optimized by post-human cognition. They did not swarm. They anchored themselves like fortresses of ceramite, weathering the storm of roaring beasts with cold, unyielding discipline. The climax of this ideological war occurred in the shadow of the Imperial goal line. A massive Orc war boss, driven mad by the intoxicating proximity of victory, abandoned all conventional rules of engagement. In a display of sheer, idiotic brutality, the behemoth unhinged its gargantuan jaw and swallowed the heavy Grav-Ball whole. With the sphere lodged in its gullet, the monster lowered its armored shoulders and charged, intending to carry the ball across the threshold within its own mutated stomach. The ground shuddered beneath the weight of his desperate sprint. Yet the angels of death know no fear, and they tolerate no heresy upon the sacred astroturf. An Astartes chaplain, serving as the central linebacker, stepped into the path of the towering monstrosity. Reciting a litany of hatred, the chaplain ignited his grav boosters, launching his armored bulk directly at the charging warboss. He delivered a flawless, devastating strike with his crackling Crozius Arcanum directly to the creature's oversized maw, turning the defensive tackle into a lethal blow. The impact sounded like a detonating artillery shell. The warboss's jaw shattered into a spray of jagged bone and foul blood, violently dislodging the Grav-Ball from its fleshy prison. The sphere arced into the air, pristine and free of Xeno's taint. Without a moment of hesitation or a single wasted breath, the Space Marines pivoted from an unbreakable defense into a lethal offense. They locked instantly into the spear of Macragge, a flawless wedge formation of interlocking shoulder guards and synchronized strides. The disorganized greenskins, now leaderless and confused by the sudden loss of their warboss, could only watch as the Adeptus Astartes marched down the field. The Orks quickly descended into vicious infighting, turning their frustrations upon each other in a frenzy of bludgeoning fists. Meanwhile, the Astartes secured a cold, calculated victory, marching the sphere across the Xenos goal line with absolute martial perfection. The Emperor's finest had secured their rightful place in the grand final, proving the supremacy of discipline over savagery. Yet even as the chants of victory echoed from the stadium shrines, a dark dread settled over the astropathic choirs. Attention now turned toward the opposite side of the bracket, where an entirely different breed of nightmare was preparing to take the field for the second semi-final. The Great Devourer. With the Emperor's Angels having secured their rightful place in the grand final, the pitch was surrendered to a clash of cosmic horrors. The second semi-final pitted the endless hunger of the Great Devourer against the dark malice of the arch-enemy. This was no mere sporting contest. It was a battle for the soul of the void, waged upon a gridiron of shifting gravity plates and blood-soaked rockcrete. The Tyranids executed their plays with the chilling perfection of the synaptic swarm. Driven by the singular, unfathomable will of the hive mind, their bioforms passed the metallic sphere with microsecond precision. Where mortal athletes would stumble upon the unpredictable gravitic inversions of the stadium, the Xenos swarm instantly adapted. Hormigaunt strikers leapt off inverted vectors, their scythe limbs propelling the sphere to waiting warriors with terrifying silent synchronicity. Against this cold biological perfection, the Chaos Space Marines unleashed an avalanche of unholy hazard play. The heretic Astartes cared nothing for the rules of the arena, seeking only to tear reality asunder to claim their dark victory. Foul incantations spilled from the vox grills of their corrupted helms as they began to infect the sphere itself with twisting warp code. The sphere screamed as it flew, its adamantine casing mutating into blistered flesh and gnashing teeth under the baleful influence of the ruinous powers. The match degenerated into a nightmare of acid, blood, and warp fire. The climax of this apocalyptic struggle arrived as a towering Tyranid swarmlord seized possession. 4 bone sabers flared as the apex predator bulldozed through the traitor defensive line, utilizing a sudden gravity shift to launch itself directly toward the chaos end zone. Victory for the Hive fleet seemed absolute. Yet the archenemy knows no limits to its depravity. A heretic Astartes, master of possession, recognizing the imminent defeat, channeled the raw, chaotic energy of the Imperium. With a roar of blasphemous triumph, he turned his dark magic upon his own defensive line. He sacrificed 3 of his own Chaos players in a blinding flash of soulfire, using their agonizing deaths to tear a localized warp rift directly onto the pitch. The screaming vortex erupted in the path of the Swarmlord, swallowing the mutated Grav-Ball whole. A heartbeat later, reality folded in upon the Tyranid goal. The warp rift violently spat the sphere back into the material realm at terminal velocity. It struck the bio-organic net with the force of a macro-cannon shell, shattering the chitinous structure into a shower of burning gore. The sheer psychic backlash of the tear in reality momentarily severed the connection of the Tyranid synapse creatures, leaving the Xenos beasts shrieking in sudden, mindless confusion. At the center of the pitch, the sorcerer captain stood triumphant, thick streams of dark blood weeping from his eyes beneath his horned helm. The forces of chaos had secured their terrifying victory. The final stage is now set, bringing the tournament to its inevitable apocalyptic crescendo. The Imperium of Man must now face its oldest, most hated foe in a grudge match that will echo across eternity. With the Great Devourer cast back into the void by the ruinous powers, a fleeting and breathless silence descends upon the galaxy. The stage is set for the ultimate reckoning between the Emperor's chosen and the great enemy. Yet the arena that housed the previous massacres is no longer sufficient to contain the apocalyptic fury of the grand final. From the orbital shipyards, the Adeptus Mechanicus command fleets of continent-sized macro-haulers to descend upon the stadium. Tethered by gravity chains thicker than hive spires, these colossal vessels drag a brand new pitch into the arena. This playing field was not built, but violently extracted from the crust of a dead world. It is a slab of bedrock hewn from a planet recently cleansed by exterminatus. Vitrified ash, fused bone, and irradiated iron form a surface hard enough to withstand the cataclysmic violence to come. Tech priests scurry across its blackened expanse like metallic insects, anointing the blasted earth with sacred unguents and blood-sealed warding runes. To witness this monument to slaughter is to demand a tithe of human souls. Across the segmentums, entire choirs of astropaths are shackled to their amplification thrones. They are forced to drink deeply of the warp, translating the sheer sensory data and picked feeds of the impending match into agonizing telepathic broadcasts. The strain is unimaginable. Minds burn out in agonizing psychic backlashes. Skulls fracture under the weight of the transmission. For every second of picked feed delivered to the waiting Imperium, 1,000 sanctioned psychers die screaming in the dark. Their charred corpses are unceremoniously swept from their seats to make way for the next tithe of living transmitters. And yet, the galaxy watches. From the deepest underhives of Necromunda to the glittering spires of Terra itself, the machinery of the Imperium grinds to an unprecedented halt. Manufactorums that have not ceased production in 10 millennia fall deadly silent. Trillions of citizens abandon their designated labor protocols, risking summary execution by the Adeptus Astartes simply to witness the spectacle. But the enforcers do not fire. They too are captivated by the looming broadcast. This is no longer a mere blood sport. It has evolved into a holy proxy war for the very survival of the human species. To look away is heresy of the highest order. The tension in the air is fatalistic, saturated with a grim religious zeal that suffocates the breath. Every citizen understands that the outcome on this irradiated slab of dead earth will echo through the immaterium forever. If the traitor legions triumph, the flame of humanity will surely extinguish in a tide of chaotic filth. If the Adeptus Astartes hold the line, the Emperor's light might endure for another bloody millennium. The macro-haulers disengage their maglocks with a deafening boom that shakes the very foundations of the arena. The dust settles over the glassine ruins of the Exterminatus scoured pitch. The void shields ignite with a blinding hum. The stage is finally consecrated in suffering, and from the shadowy depths of the gladiator pits, the titans of order and chaos begin their march toward the light. The galaxy held its collective breath as the heavens above the arena tore open. The commencement of the grand final was not marked by the trill of a mortal whistle, but by the blinding, apocalyptic descent of an orbital macro-cannon strike. Fired from a strike cruiser anchored in low orbit, the monolithic artillery shell slammed perfectly into the exact center of the grav-pitch. The impact vaporized the ceremonial center mark and bathed the stadium in a shockwave of atomic fire. As the radioactive smoke cleared from the crater, the new instrument of the game was revealed to the roaring billions. The traditional Grav-Ball had been entirely discarded for this ultimate confrontation. In its place hovered a hyperdense, magnetically contained plasma core, radiating the unbridled, blinding fury of a captive star. Yet as the deafening echo of the orbital kickoff subsided, this glorious and lethal prize was completely ignored. For 10 agonizing, blood-soaked minutes, the plasma core hovered untouched above the scorched epicenter of the pitch. The titans on the field had not come merely to score points. They had come to exact vengeance. On one side charged the Adeptus Astartes, champions of the master of mankind, their consecrated ceramite vibrating with 10 millennia of righteous fury. Opposite them sprinted the heretic Astartes, twisted mockeries of a forgotten brotherhood. The traitors swung rusted chain axes and roared maniacal laughter that echoed like a plague across the stadium voxcasters. The grav-pitch instantly dissolved into an apocalyptic massacre. This was no longer a sport of athletic strategy, but the entirety of the long war distilled into a single, brutal cycle of absolute bloodsport. There were no referees remaining brave or foolish enough to enforce the boundaries. There were no fouls to be called, no rules of engagement to govern the slaughter. There was only maximum, unrestrained lethality. High above the grinding melee, a loyalist vanguard veteran ignited his jump pack, ascending into the artificial atmosphere on twin pillars of holy fire. He was intercepted at the apex of his flight by a shrieking chaos raptor, whose mutated jump pack trailed sickly green warp flame. Their mid-air collision shattered the sound barrier, raining fragments of corrupted plasteel and blessed ceramite upon the slaughter below. This aerial duel possessed no semblance of a sporting block. It was a brutal, gladiatorial execution. The Loyalist drove his crackling power sword deep through the throat of his traitorous foe, even as the raptor buried glowing lightning claws into the chest of the Loyalist. Both warriors plummeted from the crimson sky in a tangled, lifeless mass of ruin. Their shattered bodies slammed into the deck, their blood instantly vaporizing as it splashed against the searing heat of the forgotten plasma core. Every single square meter of the colossal pitch became a grinding, merciless frontline of ancient hatred. Mass-reactive bolter rounds detonated against decaying warding runes, while whirring chainswords shrieked against ancient, unyielding power fists. The sheer magnitude of the catastrophic violence was simply too much for the architecture to endure. The immense grav plating beneath their armored boots began to buckle. Warning sirens wailed in helpless harmony with the dying as the titanic energy grids of the stadium sparked and groaned. The foundational containment fields flickered violently as the arena itself began to surrender to the chaos of the long war. The initial slaughter of the opening drive had burned itself out, leaving behind a grueling war of transhuman attrition. Only the absolute elite remained upon the shattered ferrocrete of the pitch. Both loyalist and heretic alike were battered beyond mortal comprehension, their ceramite plating cracked and weeping neurofluids. They operated now purely on the agonizing edge of post-human endurance. Yet the sheer, catastrophic kinetic output of their collisions proved too much for the ancient stadium to bear. With a groaning mechanical death rattle, the monolithic gravity generators buried deep beneath the arena simply gave out. Instantly, the match deformed into a terrifying zero-sum bloodbath suspended in the vacuum of nullified gravity. The gore of fallen champions no longer pooled upon the ground, but rather coalesced into perfect crimson spheres of floating blood. Jagged clouds of shrapnel and shattered bone drifted through the air like asteroid fields in miniature. In this silent void, a sudden and profound doctrinal clash emerged. The champions of chaos embraced the grotesque gifts of the warp to navigate the emptiness. Mutated flesh erupted from their armor, vomiting propulsive bursts of unnatural gases, while demonic possession allowed them to swim through the air on currents of pure malice. They writhed like leviathans in a pitch-black ocean. Against this nightmare, the Adeptus Astartes relied upon the cold perfection of Imperial engineering and their own spatial awareness. Micro-thrusters built into their power packs fired with mathematical precision, correcting their trajectories through the floating debris. Every movement was calculated, every thrust a testament to the indoctrinated focus of the Emperor's angels. It was in this suspended hellscape that the defining moment of the match unfolded. A hulking chaos obliterator, its flesh melded completely with the tainted plasma core, unleashed a blindingly fast pass across the void. The projectile tore through the drifting blood spheres, leaving a vapor trail of boiling gore in its wake. A Prima Ris captain, his armor scarred and his jump pack dead, found himself hopelessly out of position. With the cold, grim logic that only an Astartes possesses, he calculated his single path to victory. Drifting nearby was a massive, jagged chunk of shattered adamantium debris from the arena's ruined substructure. The captain twisted his body in the air, slamming his heavy ceramite boots into the floating wreckage. Using the debris as a brutal springboard, he launched himself across the null-gravity expanse. The captain soared directly into the path of the obliterator's unholy pass. His gauntlet snapped shut like a vice, crushing the mutated flesh of the ball just as he crashed through a suspended constellation of razor-sharp debris. The interception echoed with a resounding crack of displaced air, stealing the momentum completely from the forces of the ruinous powers. Yet even this miraculous feat was only a temporary reprieve. The arena hung in a state of suspended devastation, every survivor locked in a weightless orbit of pure hatred. Exhaustion was giving way to a desperate final fanaticism as the remaining warriors drifted toward the center of the stadium. The final moments of the grand match approached with the inevitability of a dying star. The zero-gravity stalemate had bled both sides of their final reserves, pushing gene-forged physiology and warp-tainted muscle to the absolute precipice of failure. The chronometer bled its final seconds into the void, signaling the end of regulated time and the brutal dawn of sudden death. In this unforgiving crucible, a balanced ledger of points was a blasphemy that could only be cleansed by supreme sacrifice. The loyalist Adeptus Astartes understood that conventional doctrines of war and sport had been rendered utterly obsolete. They required a maneuver born of purest devotion, a tactic whispered of only in the most venerated and lethal tactical liturgies. They enacted the formation known to the ancients as the Emperor's Spear. In perfect unspoken unison, the remaining loyalist battle brothers abandoned all pretense of defense and converged upon their designated striker. They locked their battered pauldrons together, forging an impenetrable living shield wall of scarred ceramite and unyielding flesh. Within this armoured chrysalis, the striker accepted his grim duty with the cold stoicism inherent to his transhuman lineage. He cradled the plasma core Grav-Ball against his plastron, feeling the terrifying heat of the sphere bleeding through his primary plating. There would be no evasion, no calculated feints, and no survival. With a silent litany offered to the master of mankind, the striker engaged a supercharged, heavily modified jump pack. The ancient turbines screamed as they bypassed all safety limiters, flooding the combustion chambers with highly volatile promethium. The loyalist shield wall parted for a microsecond, granting just enough clearance to unleash the wrath of the Emperor. The striker launched across the arena like a comet of righteous fury, leaving a blinding trail of searing exhaust in his wake. Standing between him and the final threshold was the traitor's designated guardian, a hulking abomination of mutated armor and dark sorcery. The striker did not attempt to throw the sphere. He became the weapon itself, committing his entire mass and velocity into a catastrophic physical collision. He rammed himself point-blank into the chest of the heretic behemoth. The sheer apocalyptic force of the kinetic impact instantly detonated the goalkeeper's corrupted battleplate, shattering the abomination into a spray of boiling gore and ruined adamantium. Rather than being repelled by the blast, the loyalist striker rode the expanding shockwave of the traitor's destruction. Enveloped in a tempest of shrapnel and unholy fire, he drove his broken body and the raging plasma ball straight through the center of the goal ring. The scoring sensor registered the momentous victory an instant before the hyper-stressed plasma core underwent catastrophic failure. The goal exploded in a blinding, transcendent flash of stellar energy, vaporizing everything within its immediate radius. The Adeptus Astartes had seized the Grand League Championship, securing a Pyrrhic victory written in blood and thermonuclear fire. Of the loyalist striker, nothing remained but a shadow burned permanently into the arena floor, and a legacy of immortal glory. As the blinding radiance faded into a thick, settling pall of ash and smoke, the ruined stadium fell into a stunned, deafening silence. The final sacrificial goal was not a miracle. It was a grim inevitability. To comprehend their absolute dominance is to understand the very nature of the Adeptus Astartes. They are the emperor of mankind's angels of death, forged not for sport, but for total and uncompromising subjugation. Their victory is a terrifying testament to transhuman biology, perfectly synthesized with psycho-indoctrinated teamwork. Mortal competitors rely on individual brilliance or fleeting emotional momentum. The Space Marines rely only on the cold, unfeeling calculus of war. Their enhanced physiology processes atmospheric friction, trajectory variables, and catastrophic blunt force trauma in a fraction of a microsecond. Yet their true supremacy does not lie in their genetic augmentations or their ceramite armor. It is rooted deeply in an absolute, unshakable willingness to accept 100% casualties to secure a single tactical objective. To a Space Marine, a shattered spine or a missing limb is merely a temporary impedance. Pain is entirely irrelevant so long as the sacred mission remains unfulfilled. They simply execute a tactical mandate with extreme prejudice. And so the great stadium slowly goes quiet. The final klaxon echoes like a hollow death knell across the bleeding, vitrified ash. For mortal champions, this moment would bring magnificent parades, planetary holidays, and immense generational wealth. But there is no prize money for the Adeptus Astartes. There is no rest, no jubilant celebration, and no quiet respite for the victors. There is only the bitter, blood-soaked reality of the Imperium. The grand trophy they have just bled and died for is not a cup of gold or a wreath of laurels. It is a priority deployment order. The surviving players do not even pause to wipe the gore from their cracked armor. Battered, broken, and crusted with their own rapidly clotting blood courtesy of their Laraman's organ, they march in perfect silent unison away from the roaring multitudes. They march straight into the shadows of the stadium orbital launch bays. Waiting for them in the dark are the idling engines of Thunderhawk gunships. The true reward for proving themselves the most unyielding force in the Grand League is the grim honor of immediate deployment. They board the assault craft in silence, and as the immense stadium roof slowly retracts, exposing the cold void of space, the gunships ascend to a strike cruiser in high orbit. Before the stadium cheers have even faded, their vessel translates into the Imperium, bound for the warp-torn edge of the Eye of Terror. They have won nothing but a one-way ticket to a grander slaughter. Down in the radioactive mud and ash of an active apocalyptic war zone, their already broken bodies will be thrown against horrors that defy all human sanity. There is no off-season for the chosen warriors of the Master of Mankind. There is no off-season for the chosen warriors of the Master of Mankind. Victory in the 41st Millennium is merely an assurance that you are worthy enough to die in a far more terrible place. The fires burn low upon the ruined pitch, casting long, shivering shadows across the shattered ceramite. The deafening roar of the masses has finally faded into a hollow, metallic echo, leaving only the grinding machinery of the Colosseum to break the heavy silence. Already the grim apparatus of renewal awakens. Legions of lobotomized servitors shuffle forth from the subterranean vaults, their dead eyes completely vacant. Mute and mindless, driven only by basic cortex commands, they drag heavy brass hoses across the cracked earth. They spray harsh chemical solvents to wash away the oceans of spilled gore that stain the playing field. The thick, crimson blood of transhuman demigods mingles freely with the foul, corrosive ichor of Xenos horrors, swirling down rusted adamantium drains in a gruesome, unified tide. Mechanized scrubbers strip the flesh from the broken armor plates left behind in the mud. Cyborg attendants thoughtlessly collect the severed limbs and crushed skulls, preparing this sacred arena for the inevitable dawn. There is no reverence for the fallen here. There is only the cold, unfeeling arithmetic of the endless cycle. This is the profound, terrifying truth of the Grand League. It is incredibly easy for the teeming trillions of the Imperium to look upon this blood sport as an escape from the crushing misery of their daily existence. They desperately want to believe that the towering stadium walls protect them, offering a fleeting distraction from the apocalyptic horrors that lurk just beyond the dying light of the Astronomicon. They are entirely deceived. This grand arena is absolutely no refuge from the encroaching darkness. It is instead a perfect condensed mirror of the galaxy itself. Every crushed spine, every treacherous ploy, and every brutal massacre executed upon this pitch is a brutal microcosm of the eternal war we wage across 1,000,000 burning worlds. The lines on the field may impose artificial boundaries, but the ultimate currency remains exactly the same. It is paid in shattered bone. It is paid in boiling blood. It is paid in the utterly disposable lives of the ignorant and the damned. The stadium is simply our galaxy stripped of its ideological pretenses, where the relentless cycle of violence is distilled into a gruesome game for the amusement of hollow, desperate souls. The citizens of the Imperium watch the slaughter, cheering for their favored champions, because to honestly face the reality of our doomed, collapsing empire would drive them instantly mad. The match never truly ends, just as the desperate wars of the God Emperor never truly cease. The servitors will soon finish their grim work. The wet ceramite will dry, the massive vault gates will open once more. A new generation of doomed gladiators will march upon the scrubbed pitch, ready to be mutilated for the fleeting approval of the mob. The grand cycle of suffering is absolute, unbroken, and infinite. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no final whistle. There is no peace amongst the stars. There is only an eternity of carnage, slaughter, and the roaring, infinite crowds of the Grand League.